Hello and welcome back to Garry's Garage, and in this episode we're going to try to get the rear diff back in place, fill the hole in the boot floor and hopefully sort out the front brakes. So last episode I took out the old rear diff and cut a big hole in the boot floor and also cut up the old diff carrier to make a new bolt together one to hold this new diff, which is about an inch longer, and that is because it has an ABS sensor in the front, which unfortunately I'm not going to be using because it puts out too many pulses per revolution for my Link G4 Plus ECU, and I'd run out of resolution at about 50-60 miles an hour, and I want to be able to get up to the top speed of the car, which is going to be 100 plus, without running out of resolution and getting a good decent number of pulses. So I have fitted back the bracket for the original speed sensor that picks up on the 4 bolts that hold the prop to the diff. So what I need to do now is think about getting this back together, but first I need to have a look at the back of the car where I cut that big old hole and get that filled in somehow. So before I put the diff back in place, I'm going to try to sort out this big hole in the boot floor. So this is where the spare wheel used to sit originally. There was a dome in there, but obviously I've taken that out in order to fit this silly rear diff. And I've got a couple of thoughts for this. Firstly, I could just plate it back over as I had before and then put my shelf in that held the petrol tank and everything's all nice. Or what I was thinking was I could take this, flip it upside down and cut away this bit of the floor up at the back here and sit this in. That will lower the petrol tank by a good 3 inches, which certainly will not hurt the centre of gravity. Getting the weight as low down in the car as possible obviously helps with handling. You don't want weight up at the top moving around, you want it lower down. So that would definitely help, and I think by doing that as well, that will add in some more edges and corners, and that should also help increase the strength of the floor rather than just putting in a flat panel. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I will need to sort out the sides on this where it curves up here, and I may need to just move these fuel and power cables out the way, but with the diff not in place now, it's going to be a lot easier to do than when I first fitted those a few months ago. So I think that is what I'm going to do. I like the idea of that, getting the weight a little bit lower, and that also gives me a little bit more height in the boot, which if I want to trim it out at a later date, gives me a little bit more options, and maybe I can even have a little bit of extra storage capacity up on the top here, on top of the tank, that I didn't have before. So I think what I am going to do is mark out around this and start to cut out some of this, ready to graft this in place as my new boot floor. Right, so that's now a nice new lowered piece of boot floor, which is going to make a fantastic place for the fuel tank to sit. About 3 inches lower down in the car, which should certainly aid with the centre of gravity. But the only thing I need to do now is that I have made these holes at the back here where the fuel and battery cable went through. Yeah, they're now in the wrong place, so I'm going to need to patch those up and drill out some new holes in order to take those through the car to the underneath. So let's crack on with that bit now.
It was at this moment that he knew. He f***ed up.
So, I am an idiot. Because... So when I put this brace in, this bit of box section, I, off camera, offered up the exhaust and it all cleared. What I didn't think about was that the exhaust loops up and over the axle, and some idiot has now put a piece of floor in the way. So the exhaust doesn't sit back where it should. So before I go too much further, I am going to pull the diff over and get that up in place, and I want to see if there's any way at all that I can do anything with this exhaust pipe. Maybe cutting through near the back box and rotating it and keeping this up and over part, or just see if there's anything I can do that doesn't involve me cutting out the floor that I've just lovingly and painstakingly welded in, because well, at least I've found this out now, and not, you know, in another 4 hours time once I've actually finished everything, although it's mostly done. So yes, I'm going to get the diff in and see if there's anything I can do to tweak this exhaust slightly. But otherwise, I think I'm going to have to chop out some of this floor I put in and put back in that hump so that the exhaust can go back up there, and then I have to remake the shelf for the tank to sit on, much like I had before, and well, at least the floor will be fairly strong with this piece of metal in place, even if I do have to cut it and move it and re-weld it to give me some space for the exhausts. Oh, I can't believe that I have done that. As I said, I'm an idiot, and that has just added hours more work on for me, possibly. On we go. So there's nothing for it. I have got to redo that boot floor. I've got to put that hump back in so that the exhaust can go in place. And the petrol tank is going to have to come back up again. Oh, I really thought I had a nice, neat solution for the petrol tank there. Get it a bit lower, reinforce the boot floor. I just did not think about those exhausts. And there's all the suspension arms in the way. There's not really anywhere that I can manipulate the exhaust to that's not going to massively reduce flow or add in lots of horrible bends, and I really don't want that, because the exhausts flow really nicely, and I think that's why the car performs so well when it's tuned right. And unlike a Legnum, which has a 2.5-inch exhaust for the whole thing with all 6 cylinders, this has got a 2.25-inch exhaust per bank per 3 cylinders, and I think that really helps those tiny little turbos at the top end, so I do not want to mess with that. So I'm going to have to undo some of what I did in the boot and or certainly the verticals on either side, unpick those, unpick the seam I did along the back, and try to fold up the floor and lay it down and just remake that hump for space for the exhausts. I could potentially actually just leave most of what I've got there and just block out a small amount, but I think it's just as much work to, maybe it's just as much work to redo the whole thing. Maybe it's less work to just add the bits, the cutouts where I need the exhaust to go. I don't know. I mean, either way, it's going to be a bit of wasted space in the boot there because I'm going to have to put a floor on it to put the petrol tank on. So I will have a bit of a think over a cup of tea and decide what I'm going to do with it. Just over halfway now, yeah?
Yeah, I'll tell you.
So after a quick call to my stepdad, he's popped round and helped me to, with a hammer and dolly, just get this contour a bit nicer, just take out these old folds that were there. So I was underneath with either the hammer or the dolly, and he was on top with the other one, and we were just gently bashing it into rough shape. I am, however, currently out of MIG welding wire and also gas, and it is now Saturday afternoon, so they won't be available until Monday. So what I'm going to do is move to the front of the car and have a look at swapping out the brakes. So, brakes. My current brakes have been on the car for 7 or 8 years since we first put brakes on the car, well before it went on the road, and it was the cheapest discs, cheapest pads possible. And they have been okay, but I think now, especially with them being sat for so long after being used and the very gentle braking I've done, I think they're due a change. So I've got myself some Mintex racing pads and also some nice new discs, and these ones are vented but also grooved and drilled for mostly looks. There are reasons for doing this. On the car I've got, the driving I'm doing and the speeds I'm going to be doing, probably not really relevant, but they were some reasonable discs at not too bad a price, and they just so happened to be drilled and grooved, so we'll see how they go. But it's not as simple as just swapping those on, because of course I make everything difficult, and I wanted to add a few more pulses coming from the front wheels for speed sensor, and I did that by drilling some holes into the back of the disc and adding more bolt heads, which means that I've got to do that all over again on one of these new discs. So let's get into doing that. So first thing will be to get the old stuff off. I can at least get one side up, and that will be the passenger side, the driver's side. I can get that on and done. And then I can look at re-drilling out one of these discs. So that's the easy side done on the driver's side. The passenger side I've made slightly more difficult for myself because I have added a speed sensor on this wheel, and because I wasn't happy with how many pulses I was getting per revolution from just the 4 bolts on the disc that hold it to the hub, I added some more, which you may remember from episode 3 or something. And that worked reasonably well, but there was a problem with it. And that is that I spaced the bolts out evenly on the disc, but I'm using different sized bolts. So I have 14mm heads for the 4 main mounting bolts, and then I was using 10mm heads for the others, and I spaced the sensors evenly. And what that meant was that as it moved round and the head of the bolt came past the sensor, the points at where the signal drops off at the edge of the bolt, well, they were spaced differently. So between the bigger bolt head and the next smaller bolt head was a smaller gap than between 2 of the smaller bolts, and then an even bigger gap between the end of the second small bolt and the next big bolt. So looking at the graph on the ECU of what the speed sensors are doing, the rear one gives a nice smooth graph, and the front one was giving a bit of a jagged one, as the distances between these bolt heads were different. So in order to try to resolve that, I have been on the computer and made use of the 3D printer again, and I've made myself a template. And what I have tried to do with this, and we will see once I've actually got it done whether it works, is these holes. I've also added 4 more just for even more frequency, but all of these holes now and the bolt heads should be an equal distance apart where the bolt heads finish. So I'm hoping once I put this on here, bolt it down and drill through the small holes and get them tapped and new bolt heads installed, that should do the trick, because the traction control relies on this speed being correct, and the erraticness of the sensor previously was causing some problems with the traction control. So I definitely hope that this does the trick. So I need to get this bolted up and accurately drill all of these holes out using my guide. So let's get on and get that done. So that's the brakes done at the front now, and I can turn my attention back to the boot floor. I have a new bottle of gas for the MIG and also a new reel of wire, so I can get cracking on with tacking this back edge down, filling in the holes and looking at getting the tank back in along with all of the pipework. Never ending. And I really wish I'd thought about those exhausts before I started chopping all of that out, because I could have just simply fixed up the little bit of the old spare wheel well that had come loose, put the shelf for the petrol tank back in, and job done. But as it is, of course, I give myself a lot more work. Always the way, but, well, I'm going to have a nice strong boot floor now, because this is slightly thicker metal than the original stuff, so all good, I suppose. So there's the boot floor replaced and all patched up. Yeah, in hindsight I should have thought first and not chopped out all of the old boot floor. And in an ideal world I would cut out the whole boot floor and replace it with an original piece. But I'm in a make do and mend situation at the moment, and that will do for my purposes at the moment. So what I need to do now is remake a shelf for the petrol tank to sit on and re-drill the holes going through the floor in order to run the power cable and the fuel lines. So I've folded up a very basic shelf. I have just folded over the edges. I haven't put any kind of beads into the middle of it. And for the moment I'm thinking that I'm actually going to make this a bolt-in panel rather than welded in, just because at a later date when I come round to doing a bit more work on the car, I know that I want to tidy up this boot floor, and having this bolted in rather than welded will make life a lot easier. So it's in the right place, I've marked it up, so I'll whip the tank back out and get this bolted to the floor, and then I can look at adding in the holes back through the floor for the battery cable and the fuel lines. So I've given that new boot floor a lick of primer just to give it a little bit of protection, and all that's needed now is to start putting everything back in place. So that's all the fuel and power lines through the floor, fuel tank in place, diff and all the suspension components, and do an alignment and go out for a test drive. And none of that I have any time for today, because otherwise this video will be late. So unfortunately, due to my idiocy and not thinking properly about what I was going to do with the exhaust or where the exhaust run, obviously I had to spend a lot of extra time redoing a lot of work that I didn't need to do, and I could have just replaced that one oval shaped piece of metal where the spare wheel well was, and everything would have been a lot quicker. But it's done now. I can't undo the change that I've made. Well, I've fixed the mess up that I've done, but I can't roll back in time and not make the mistake in the first place. But I did, at least whilst I was waiting for my gas and wire for the MIG, because of course they both ran out at the same time on a Saturday afternoon when I couldn't get anything then until at least Tuesday, is I was able to get my 3D printed spacer up and get the front brake discs and pad changed. So that hopefully will improve the braking performance quite a lot. I really do think that the cheap pads that I had and the old discs that have been sat around getting rusty and then scrubbed off again over the years, just not really up to the job anymore. So nice new brakes will hopefully sort that. So as I said, we'll have to do all of that I mentioned before next time, so please join me, and if you really enjoy what I'm doing, hit that like button, and if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing so you're notified as soon as I post a new video. And if you really want to support me like some wonderful people whose names are on screen now have, you can join me on Patreon. All the links you need are down in the description. So I want to say a big thank you to everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.